The moment I heard what he had done, it didn't feel real. I just sat there, staring at the screen, reading the update again and again like it might change. It didn't. Years of effort were pushed aside in one move I never saw coming. Not because I failed, but because someone else decided I didn't matter. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I'm Bryn Hale. I've always believed that if you stay focused, do the work, and keep your promises, things will work out. That belief carried me through long nights, tough calls, and moments when quitting would have been easier. I wasn't chasing attention or shortcuts. I just wanted results. What hurt the most wasn't the loss itself, it was how easily I was replaced. No conversation, no warning, no respect. Just a quiet decision made behind closed doors, like everything I built meant nothing. I remember sitting at my desk, trying to process it. My hands were still, but my mind wasn't. Questions kept hitting me one after another. How did it come to this? What did I miss? And why did it feel like I was the only one who cared about what was at stake? That day changed something in me. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady shift. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped assuming effort would protect me. And for the first time, I realized that sometimes the real challenge isn't the work, it's the people standing between you and it. I didn't step into something ready-made. What I had came from years of steady effort, small wins, and a lot of patience. I started with nothing but a list of cold contacts and turned them into people who trusted me enough to listen, then to work with me, and eventually to rely on me. That kind of trust doesn't happen overnight. It takes showing up again and again, even when it's inconvenient. There were nights I stayed back long after everyone left, fixing details most people wouldn't even notice. I remember taking calls during family dinners, stepping outside just to make sure nothing slipped. It wasn't about proving myself to others, it was about keeping my word. If I said I would handle something, I made sure it was done right. Over time, those efforts turned into something bigger. People didn't just see me as a contact, they saw me as someone they could count on. They came to me directly, asked for my opinion, trusted my judgment. That's how everything started to grow. Not fast, not easy, but solid. The opportunity in front of us didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from careful planning, understanding what each client needed, and knowing how to deliver it. I knew every detail, every concern, every expectation. I had built something stable, something that worked. That's why what happened later felt so wrong. It wasn't just work being shifted around. It was something personal, something I had shaped piece by piece, suddenly treated like it didn't belong to me at all. Things started to shift the week he walked in. You could feel it before he even made changes. The tone in meetings changed, the way decisions were made felt rushed, and people who had been steady for years suddenly looked unsure. He spoke with confidence, but there was a gap between what he said and how things actually worked. At first, I stayed quiet and observed. New leadership always brings change, and I wasn't against that. But this felt different. It wasn't about improving systems or fixing weak spots. It felt like decisions were being made without understanding the foundation they were built on. He began calling short meetings, asking surface-level questions, and making quick calls right after. There was no effort to learn the history behind accounts or why certain approaches worked. It was like he was trying to move pieces on a board without knowing the rules of the game. People started whispering after those meetings. Small concerns at first, then more serious ones. I noticed experienced team members being overlooked while others, who hadn't handled much pressure before, were suddenly being pulled into important conversations. That's when one name started coming up again and again, Cale Dre. At first, I didn't think much of it. But the more I heard it, the more it stood out. His name kept appearing in discussions where it didn't make sense. It felt out of place, like something was being forced into position. I didn't react right away. I told myself to wait, to see how things played out. But deep down, I had a feeling that these changes weren't random. Something was being set in motion, and I was starting to see where it might lead. I found out in the most casual way, like it was nothing important. A short message, a quick update, and just like that, everything shifted. There was no meeting, no proper explanation, just a decision already made. I read it twice, trying to understand how something so big could be handled so lightly. At first, I thought it was temporary. Maybe a small adjustment or a shared responsibility. But the more details came in, the clearer it became. Control had already been handed over, and I was no longer part of the process in the way I had always been. What made it worse wasn't just the change, it was how it was done. No one asked for my input, even though I knew every part of the work. I had been involved in every step, every discussion, every detail that shaped where things stood. And now, suddenly, I was pushed to the side like my role had never mattered. I tried to stay calm and think clearly. Getting emotional wouldn't fix anything. But inside, there was a mix of confusion and frustration that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just about responsibility, it was about respect. And that was missing completely. I watched as things moved forward without me. Conversations I used to lead were happening without my name being mentioned. Updates came through secondhand. It felt strange, like standing outside something I had built myself. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a simple change. It was a decision that cut me out completely, and it was done in a way that made it clear my voice no longer counted. I didn't stay silent after that. I knew what was at risk, so I chose to speak up while there was still time to fix things. I reached out calmly and asked for a proper conversation. I wasn't trying to take anything back, I just wanted to make sure nothing important was overlooked. When we finally talked, I kept it simple and direct. I explained how the client worked, what they expected, and where things could go wrong if certain steps were missed. I pointed out small details that might seem minor to others but actually mattered a lot in keeping everything on track. These weren't guesses. They were based on real situations I had already handled. I also made it clear that timing was critical. There were parts of the process that couldn't be rushed or handled casually. If even one piece slipped, it could affect everything that followed. I wasn't trying to criticize anyone, I was trying to prevent a problem before it happened. But the response I got didn't match the seriousness of what I was saying. It felt like my concerns were being reduced to personal opinion instead of professional insight. The tone was dismissive, like I was overreacting or making things complicated on purpose. I left that conversation feeling uneasy. Not because I had failed to explain, but because I could tell I wasn't being heard. I had shared what I knew in the clearest way I could, yet it didn't seem to matter. After that, I stepped back. I had done what I could. The warning was there, whether anyone chose to act on it or not. It didn't take long for problems to appear. At first, they were small enough that most people didn't notice. A delay here, a slight change there, things that could easily be brushed off. But I could see the pattern forming. These weren't random mistakes, they were signs that something deeper wasn't being handled right. I started noticing gaps in communication. Important updates weren't being shared on time. Questions from the client were answered too late or without full clarity. There were moments where the response sounded confident but didn't actually address what was being asked. That kind of thing builds doubt, even if it's subtle at first. Then came the inconsistencies. Numbers didn't line up the way they should. Certain expectations were set without checking if they could actually be met. It created a gap between what was promised and what could be delivered. I had seen this kind of situation before, and it rarely ends well. I kept my distance, even though it was difficult. Part of me wanted to step in and fix things, but I knew that wouldn't be welcomed. Instead, I watched carefully, paying attention to how each issue was handled. And most of the time, it wasn't handled at all, it was just pushed forward like it would somehow resolve on its own. The pressure started building quietly. You could feel it in meetings, in the tone of emails, in the way people avoided certain topics. It was clear that things were slipping, even if no one said it out loud. By that point, I wasn't surprised anymore. I had already seen enough to understand where this was heading. The end came without any warning. There was no long discussion or chance to recover. Just a short message that the client was stepping away. I read it once, then again, hoping I misunderstood something. But it was clear. Everything had stopped. For a moment, the office felt unusually quiet. People moved around like normal, but there was a shift in the air. Something important had just been lost, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it directly. I stayed at my desk, trying to take it in, thinking about how quickly things had changed. I didn't feel shock as much as a heavy sense of confirmation. This was exactly the direction things had been moving toward. Every small issue that had been ignored had added up to this point. It wasn't sudden, it just looked that way from the outside. Not long after, I was asked to come in for a meeting. The tone was serious, but not in the way I expected. Instead of focusing on what had gone wrong overall, the conversation started shifting toward me. The questions were indirect, but I could see where they were going. I listened carefully, choosing my words with care. I wasn't defensive, but I wasn't going to accept something that wasn't mine either. It was clear they were looking for an easy answer, something simple to point at. Sitting there, I realized this wasn't just about a lost deal anymore. It was about how quickly responsibility can be redirected when things fall apart. The conversation quickly turned in a direction I had expected but still didn't like hearing. The focus wasn't on what actually happened. Instead, it became about what I supposedly didn't do. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. They were trying to shift the weight onto me. I stayed quiet at first and let them talk. It's easier to understand someone's position when you don't interrupt. The more they spoke, the more the story started to take shape, one that didn't match reality. It painted a picture where I was somehow responsible without being directly involved. What stood out to me was how selective everything sounded. Only certain moments were mentioned, while others were completely ignored. Important details were left out, especially the ones that would have changed the whole situation. It wasn't confusion. It felt controlled. I kept my expression steady, even though I could feel the tension building inside. Reacting emotionally would only make things easier for them. Instead, I focused on listening and remembering exactly what was being said. Every sentence, every claim, it all mattered now. By the time they finished, I understood what this really was. It wasn't about finding the truth or fixing anything. It was about protecting certain decisions and placing the outcome on someone else. That's when I realized I was ready. I didn't need to argue or raise my voice. I already had everything I needed. The facts were clear, and they were on my side. It was just a matter of choosing the right moment to bring them forward. I walked out of that room without saying much. There was no point in pushing back right then. I knew how those conversations go. Once people decide on a version of events, they don't change it in the moment. So I kept my thoughts to myself and returned to my desk with a clear head. Instead of reacting, I focused on being precise. I started going through my records slowly and carefully. I checked past conversations, meeting notes, and timelines. Not to prove a point emotionally, but to make sure everything was clear and easy to follow. I wanted facts that spoke for themselves. As I went through everything, the sequence became sharper. Each step showed how decisions were made and how things moved from one stage to the next. Nothing needed to be exaggerated. It was all there already, laid out over time. I organized everything in a way that made sense. Dates lined up, actions matched outcomes, and gaps became visible without me having to explain them. It wasn't about creating a story, it was about showing what actually happened in the simplest form. I didn't rush. I took my time to make sure nothing was missed and nothing was unclear. The goal wasn't to overwhelm anyone, but to remove any space for confusion. When everything is clear, there's no need for long explanations. By the end of it, I felt calm. Not because the situation had improved, but because I knew I was prepared. I had something solid to stand on, and that made all the difference. The review started quickly after everything went wrong. People from different departments were called in, and the atmosphere changed again. This time, it wasn't about guessing or opinions. It was about going through every step and understanding how things reached that point. When my turn came, I didn't feel pressure the way I expected. I had already gone through everything carefully on my own, so I wasn't guessing or trying to remember details. I knew exactly what I needed to say and how to present it. I began from the start, laying out the sequence in a simple way. Each stage was connected to the next, showing how decisions were made and where things started to drift off track. I didn't rush through it or add extra explanation. I just followed the order of events. As I spoke, I could see people paying closer attention. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was just clear. The kind of clarity that comes when facts are placed in the right order without anything missing. I made sure to highlight who was involved at each step and what choices were made when pressure started building. I also pointed out where concerns had been raised earlier but not acted on. Everything I shared was backed by records that were already part of the system. There was no emotion in what I presented, just structure. By the end, the picture was complete enough that no one needed extra explanation. What stood out most wasn't what I said, but the silence afterward. It was the kind of silence that happens when everything finally makes sense without needing further argument. No one spoke right away after I finished. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels awkward, it was heavier, like people were processing what they had just heard and realizing how different the situation actually was. A few looked down at their notes, others just stayed still, waiting for someone else to say something first. After that meeting, things didn't move slowly. Decisions were made quickly, and the company started shifting direction almost immediately. I didn't hear much at first, but the changes became obvious through small signs, meetings getting shorter, certain names disappearing from calendars, and responsibilities being reassigned without explanation. Cale was the first to be removed from his position. It wasn't announced loudly, but people found out soon enough. There wasn't much discussion around it. It felt like a quiet correction rather than a public event. Not long after, Corin was also out of the picture. His role didn't hold for much longer once everything was reviewed properly. What surprised me wasn't just their exit, but how quickly attitudes shifted afterward. The same people who had questioned me earlier were now acting differently. Conversations that once ignored my input started coming back my way. There was a noticeable change in how I was treated, even in small interactions. I didn't rush to respond to it. I stayed steady and let things settle on their own. Trust, once shaken, doesn't rebuild instantly. But I could see the direction things were heading, and for the first time in a while, it felt like the truth had finally taken its place. I didn't feel the need for celebration or big reactions. Everything had already settled in its own way, and I was more focused on what came next than what had just happened. There was no rush in my steps, just a steady return to where I knew I could be useful again. I started rebuilding pieces of what had been disrupted, one part at a time. It wasn't about restoring everything exactly as it was before. Some things had changed for good, and I accepted that. Instead, I focused on creating a stronger base, something that wouldn't fall apart so easily if tested again. I also became more careful about how I worked. I kept clearer records, paid closer attention to decisions, and made sure I wasn't leaving important things open or untracked. It wasn't out of fear, it was just experience teaching me how quickly things can shift when you least expect it. People around me started noticing the difference too. Not because I said anything, but because the way I worked had changed. I was more direct, more organized, and less willing to leave things unclear. It created a quiet respect that didn't need to be discussed openly. Looking back, I didn't see the loss as the end of something. It became a turning point that showed me who truly understood the value of what I had built, and who didn't. Some people faded out of the picture completely, while others started to see things differently. In the end, I didn't just recover what was lost. I came out with a clearer sense of control over my own work and a stronger understanding that recognition doesn't come from words, it comes from results that speak for themselves.